In under an hour, more than 50 American airstrikes hit a single island barely 3 miles wide, and within minutes, the lights went out completely. Tonight, we're going back to the strike on Kharg Island that plunged Iran's most important economic asset into total darkness, and showing you exactly what that blackout actually cost months later. August 9th, 2026. And this is the story of the single strike that did more lasting damage to Iran's economy than almost any other operation in this entire war. Not because of how many buildings it destroyed, but because of what happened in the minutes immediately after the bombs stopped falling. Kharg Island, a small coral outcrop sitting roughly 16 miles off Iran's Gulf coast, barely large enough to walk across in an afternoon, went completely dark. Exactly what happened, because the sequence still tells you everything about how modern economic warfare actually works. According to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. fighter jets bombed more than 50 military targets on Kharg Island in a single overnight operation. Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane confirmed the scale directly, stating that precision strikes were conducted against more than 90 targets on the island, hitting what he described as all of their military-only infrastructure, which included air defenses, naval base, mine storage, and deployment facilities. President Trump, never one to undersell a strike, declared the U.S. military had totally obliterated every military target on the island, later adding, with characteristic bravado, a threat to hit it a few more times just for fun. Then came the detail that turned a military strike into an economic earthquake. According to reporting confirmed by Anadolu Ajansi and multiple Iranian outlets, power was cut off across Kharg Island within minutes of the strikes concluding. Iran's own Mehr news agency confirmed that U.S. and Israeli warplanes had carried out multiple airstrikes on the island, producing several large explosions, and that the power failure occurred almost immediately afterward. Translate what that blackout actually meant on the ground, because it's easy to read past a single sentence about a power outage without grasping its scale. Kharg Island isn't just a military outpost. It's the physical chokepoint through which nearly 90% of Iran's entire crude oil export economy flows. Pumping stations, loading arm control systems, the pressurized systems that move crude oil from onshore storage tanks into supertankers moored offshore. All of it depends on a functioning electrical grid. When that grid goes dark, even for a matter of hours, an entire nation's primary source of foreign currency effectively stops moving. Here's the number that makes this strike different from almost every other target hit in this war. About 9 out of every 10 barrels of crude oil Iran exports gets loaded onto tankers at this single facility, according to Financial Times reporting, cited by the Jerusalem Post, because much of the rest of the country's coastline is simply too shallow to accommodate the massive supertankers that carry Iranian crude to buyers around the world. There is no meaningful backup, no alternative terminal capable of absorbing that volume if Kharg goes offline. When American bombs cut the power to this specific island, they weren't just degrading a set of military assets, they were reaching directly into the single most sensitive pressure point in Iran's entire wartime economy. And here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, because the initial damage assessment told a very different story than the blackout implied. Iran's semi-official Mehr news agency reported in the days immediately following the strike that maritime infrastructure on the island, the actual loading, terminals and export machinery suffered little damage and continued operating normally. Iran's Fars news agency, citing sources on the ground, insisted there had been no damage to oil facilities at all, despite Trump's public claims of total destruction. CNN's own reporting confirmed Iranian damage assessments found most of the oil transport hub's infrastructure intact. Vice President J.D. Vance, acknowledging the strikes publicly, was careful to note they did not mark a change in strategy, a phrase that, translated honestly, suggests even the White House understood this specific strike was more about sending a message than achieving permanent infrastructure destruction. Satellite imagery taken just days after the bombing, according to Wikipedia's dedicated tracking of the strike, showed the terminal continuing to operate as an export hub, with 3 tankers still moored at its berths. So which is it? Did the strike on Kharg Island accomplish something real, or was it, as Iranian state media insisted, mostly theater? Dozens of military targets destroyed, while the actual economic engine of the island kept humming along undisturbed. The answer, it turns out, took months to fully reveal itself, and it's far more consequential than either side's initial claims suggested. There's a detail worth sitting with here, because it captures the strange information war running alongside the physical one. Both governments had powerful incentives to describe the same event in opposite terms. Washington wanted a dramatic, decisive strike to point to as proof of overwhelming military reach, hence Trump's language of total obliteration and his half-joking threat to strike the island again, just for fun. Tehran wanted to project resilience to its own population and to global oil markets, watching nervously for signs the war might finally choke off Iranian crude entirely, hence the swift insistence from Fars and Mayer that damage was minimal and operations continued as normal. Neither government was lying outright. They were simply describing different layers of the same event, the visible military destruction on one hand, and the underlying economic machinery on the other, each side emphasizing whichever layer served its own narrative in the days immediately following the strike. To understand what the Kharg Island strike actually accomplished, you can't just look at the night the bombs fell. You have to look at what's happening on that island right now, in the first week of August, because the true damage from this operation didn't show up in a single dramatic blackout. It showed up slowly in satellite images of empty berths, in tanker tracking data showing zero movement, in an economic strangulation that took months to fully tighten. Here's where things stand today. According to Financial Times reporting cited, by the Jerusalem Post, no tankers have loaded at Kharg Island for at least a week as of this past Friday, with shipping and satellite data confirming the renewed U.S. naval blockade has brought Tehran's crude oil sales to a complete halt. Operations at the island halted entirely on July 31st, according to Kepler and Energy Aspects, two of the world's leading intelligence providers tracking global energy and shipping movements. Maritime intelligence company Windward confirmed satellite images showing all three of the island's berths sitting empty for an extended period. The loading platforms that once processed, the overwhelming majority of Iran's export economy now sitting idle, watched by orbiting cameras that show nothing moving at all. Translate what that emptiness actually represents, because it's the culmination of everything that began the night the lights went out. The U.S. reimposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports in mid-July, according to that same Financial Times reporting, after an interim agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz collapsed. That blockade, layered on top of the accumulated damage and disruption from months of strikes, has succeeded in achieving something the initial bombing run alone couldn't fully accomplish: a complete, sustained halt to Iran's primary oil export channel, not through direct destruction of every piece of infrastructure, but through a combination of degraded capacity, persistent military pressure, and naval interdiction that together have proven more effective than any single night of strikes. Richard Brons, head of geopolitics at Energy Aspects, offered a blunt assessment of just how successful this specific blockade has become. The blockade is effective in the sense that there isn't much tanker traffic going in nor out, he said. But his next observation reveals something crucial about Iran's own calculus, something that should reshape how you think about whether this entire campaign, from the April blackout through the current standstill, has actually worked as intended. Brons noted that the loss of export revenue was not expected to put immediate pressure on Tehran to compromise in negotiations with the United States, explaining that it's pretty clear that the Iranians feel they have the upper hand when it comes to Hormuz, and they are willing to absorb a great deal of economic pain to exploit their advantage. That assessment cuts directly against the strategic logic that likely justified the original strike back in April. When the U.S. hit Kharg Island and cut its power in the middle of the night, the implicit bet was that crippling Iran's oil revenue would force concessions, that a nation watching its primary source of foreign currency go dark would eventually come to the negotiating table on Washington's terms. Instead, according to the traders and analysts actually tracking Iran's behavior in real time, Tehran appears to have concluded the opposite, that it can absorb this specific pain indefinitely, using its own control over Hormuz as leverage against Gulf neighbors and global oil markets that are arguably suffering just as much from the disruption as Iran itself. There is an environmental dimension to this story that rarely makes it into strategic analysis, but deserves attention here, because it captures just how visceral this economic war has become. The Jerusalem Post's own analysis described Kharg Island's ongoing crisis in stark terms: empty jetties, dwindling shipments, and what the piece called mysterious oil slicks appearing in surrounding waters, not isolated incidents of maritime logistics or accidental pollution, but what the analysis termed the jagged edges of a nation grappling with the exhaustion of its most vital economic asset. A war fought partly through cutting the power to a single island has produced consequences that extend from oil markets in Shanghai to slicks visible in satellite imagery of the Persian Gulf itself. And the China dimension deserves specific attention because it explains why Iran has been willing to absorb this pain rather than fold. Wikipedia's tracking of the strike confirms that much of the oil shipped from Iran through Kharg Island is exported specifically to China, with Iranian oil accounting for approximately 11.5% of China's total seaborne crude imports through 2026. That relationship gives Tehran a buyer willing to continue purchasing discounted, sanctioned Iranian crude regardless of American pressure, a lifeline that has allowed Iran's leadership to treat months of blockade and disrupted exports as a survivable cost of war rather than an existential economic threat. exactly the calculation Bronze described when he said Tehran believes it holds the upper hand. There's a broader shipping picture worth understanding too, because Kharg Island's paralysis doesn't exist in isolation from the rest of the regional maritime crisis this war has produced. With the Strait of Hormuz itself subject to intermittent closures, blockades, and attacks on individual vessels throughout this year, insurers tracking Gulf shipping risk have pushed war risk premiums to levels rarely seen outside active combat zones, according to industry analysis from Marsh cited earlier in coverage of this conflict. Every tanker that might otherwise consider risking a run to Kharg Island now has to weigh that decision against insurance costs that can add hundreds of thousands of dollars to a single voyage, on top of the more immediate risk of encountering the American naval blockade directly. That combination, physical interdiction plus a shipping insurance market effectively pricing Kharg Island as a war zone, has proven far more durable at strangling Iranian exports than any single night of airstrikes managed on its own. So if the blackout itself didn't force Iran to the table, and the ongoing blockade hasn't broken Tehran's resolve either, what did the Kharg Island strike actually accomplish? To answer that, you have to separate three distinct things that have gotten conflated in coverage of this operation: the tactical military damage, the psychological and economic signal it sent, and the longer-term strategic position it's created heading into the current standoff over the Strait of Hormuz. Start with the tactical reality, because the competing damage assessments from April actually tell a coherent story once you place them side by side. American officials were accurate about hitting more than 50, possibly 90, distinct military targets: air defenses, naval bases, mine storage and deployment facilities, exactly the kind of hardened military infrastructure CENTCOM has targeted repeatedly throughout this war. Iranian officials were also accurate when they said the actual oil-loading machinery, the maritime terminal infrastructure itself, suffered comparatively little direct damage and continued operating in the strike's immediate aftermath. Both claims can be true simultaneously because American planners appear to have deliberately distinguished between military infrastructure they were willing to destroy outright and the core export terminal machinery they left largely intact, at least in that specific April strike, a calculated restraint that likely reflected concern over exactly the kind of global oil price shock a fully destroyed Kharg Island would have triggered. That distinction matters enormously for understanding what's happened since. The April strike proved a capability that the U.S. could reach Kharg Island, cut its power, and destroy dozens of military targets within a single night without necessarily destroying the terminal's actual export function. That demonstrated capability became the foundation for everything that followed. The renewed naval blockade in mid-July, the complete halt to loading operations by July 31st, and the current standoff where all three berths sit empty, watched by satellites with zero tanker traffic moving in or out. In other words, the blackout wasn't really the end point of this strategy. It was the opening move, a demonstration of vulnerability that set up the sustained blockade now actually accomplishing what the single night of bombing alone never fully could. There's a broader strategic pattern here worth translating, because it echoes a phrase used earlier in this war when discussing Iran's other buried and hardened infrastructure. Just as Iran learned that above-ground fuel depots in Tehran were vulnerable and responded by burying replacement infrastructure underground, Kharg Island's operators appear to have learned that direct military destruction wasn't actually the primary threat to worry about. Sustained naval interdiction was. You can rebuild a damaged loading arm or restore power to a substation within days, which is precisely what Iranian engineers appear to have done in the immediate aftermath of the April strike. Given that satellite imagery days later showed the terminal still functioning with tankers moored at its berths. What you cannot easily route around is a persistent American naval blockade actively preventing tankers from approaching the island at all, regardless of how intact the loading infrastructure itself remains. Consider what this reveals about the actual balance of power emerging from this specific front of the war. Analysts noted at the time of the April strike that Kharg Island represented a potential weak spot for Iran, with some reports suggesting Washington was even considering ground invasion options centered on seizing the island outright, according to ABC News Australia, reporting from March. And that kind of escalation never materialized. Instead, the war over Kharg Island evolved into something closer to a siege than a demolition, months of accumulated pressure, periodic strikes, and now a sustained blockade that has succeeded in halting exports entirely without, requiring American forces to ever set foot on Iranian soil or fully destroy a single loading terminal. And that siege-style outcome may ultimately prove more strategically significant than a single night of dramatic destruction ever could have been. A destroyed terminal is a target Iran can rebuild, reroute around, or replace with hardened alternative infrastructure over time, exactly the pattern this war has produced repeatedly with fuel depots, radar stations, and command centers elsewhere in the country. A sustained naval blockade, backed by the credible threat of exactly the kind of strike that plunged the island into darkness back in April is a form of pressure Iran cannot engineer its way around, no matter how much hardening or redundancy it builds into its physical infrastructure. That may be the real, lasting lesson of Kharg Island's blackout. It wasn't really about what got destroyed. That night, it was about proving American forces could reach, disable, and threaten to return to the single most important node in Iran's entire export economy whenever Washington chose to. There's a comparison worth drawing here to how this same siege logic has played out elsewhere in this war. Just as the Strait of Hormuz blockade has managed to strangle broader Iranian shipping without requiring the destruction of a single tanker, and just as the underground fuel and weapons network across the mainland has proven more vulnerable to sustained attrition than any single strike, Kharg Island's story confirms a pattern this entire conflict keeps repeating. Physical destruction captures headlines, but persistent, unglamorous pressure, blockades, interdictions, sanctions enforcement is proving to be the tool actually reshaping Iran's wartime economy month over month. The blackout made for a dramatic opening chapter. The empty berths sitting there today are the quieter, more consequential sequel. Most coverage of this war has barely mentioned. So where does this leave us, standing here in the first week of August, looking back at a strike that plunged an island into total darkness in minutes, only to watch its real consequences unfold in slow motion across the following 4 months? Let's pull the complete picture together, because the story of Kharg Island tells us something essential about how economic warfare actually functions in this conflict, distinct from the dramatic strikes on refineries, bunkers, and command centers that have dominated most of this war's coverage. First, understand that the blackout itself was never really the point. It was a demonstration. The moment the lights went out on Kharg Island, Washington proved something to Tehran that no amount of rhetoric could have communicated as effectively. That the single physical choke point responsible for 9 out of every 10 barrels of Iranian crude oil exports was neither too important nor too well defended to reach. Every subsequent decision Iran has made about hardening its infrastructure, rerouting exports, and absorbing months of blockade-driven revenue loss traces back to that specific proof of vulnerability delivered in a single overnight operation back in April. Second, watch the current blockade closely in the weeks ahead, because it represents the strategy's actual mature form, not its opening act. 0 tanker loadings for at least a week. As of this past Friday, all 3 berths confirmed empty by independent satellite intelligence providers, a complete halt to operations that's held since July 31st. That is a far more economically devastating outcome than the April strike alone ever achieved. And it's been accomplished not through additional bombing runs, but through the credible threat established by that original blackout combined with sustained naval interdiction that doesn't require destroying a single additional building. Third, consider what Iran's continued resistance despite this pressure actually reveals about the limits of economic warfare as a war-ending strategy. Richard Bronze's assessment that Tehran feels it holds the upper hand and is willing to absorb enormous economic pain to exploit its leverage over Hormuz suggests that months of blackouts, blockades, and halted exports haven't produced the capitulation this entire strategy was presumably designed to achieve. Iran's continued access to Chinese buyers willing to purchase discounted crude, even amid a near-total blockade at its primary export. Terminal has apparently given Tehran enough of an economic cushion to treat this entire front of the war as survivable rather than existential, a calculation that may frustrate American planners but appears, so far, to be holding. Fourth, and this is the number that should stay with you long, after this video ends, 11.5%. That's the share of China's total seaborne crude oil imports that Iranian exports through Kharg Island represent, even in the middle of a war, even after a blackout, even after months of blockade. That single trading relationship, more than any military hardening or diplomatic maneuvering, may be the real reason Kharg Island's darkness back in April never produced the decisive economic collapse some in Washington likely hoped for, and why the current empty berths, however dramatic they look in satellite imagery, haven't yet forced Tehran back to the negotiating table on American terms. So here's the uncomfortable truth this entire story leads to. The strike that plunged Kharg Island into darkness in minutes back in April was, by any conventional military measure, a resounding tactical success. Dozens of targets destroyed, air defenses eliminated, a demonstration of reach that set the stage for everything that's followed. But 4 months later, with all 3 berths sitting empty and 0 tankers moving in or out, the strategic question this entire campaign was actually meant to answer, whether crippling Iran's oil export capacity would force Tehran into a favorable settlement, remains genuinely unresolved. Iran hasn't folded. It's absorbed the pain, leaned on its relationship with Chinese buyers, and, according to the analysts actually tracking the standoff in real time, concluded it can outlast a blockade that's already stretched on for weeks with no clear end date. What happens next depends on variables that remain unsettled even now. Whether China's appetite for discounted Iranian crude continues indefinitely or eventually wavers under its own pressures, whether the current blockade holds long enough to finally force the kind of concession Braun says Tehran has so far resisted, and whether Washington escalates back toward the kind of direct strikes that first darkened this island, or continues relying on the quieter, more sustained pressure of naval interdiction that's brought exports to a complete standstill, without a single additional bomb being dropped. One thing is certain tonight. The island that went dark in minutes back in April is, in its own way, still dark today. Its berths empty, its tankers gone, a physical monument to a war being fought as much through blockades and blackouts as through the missiles and airstrikes that dominate every other headline. If you want to understand exactly how the Strait of Hormuz blockade that's now strangling Kharg Island first began, go back and watch our full breakdown linked right here. And if you think Iran can keep absorbing this level of economic pressure indefinitely, let me know in the comments below, because this is a story we are not done telling.